This video is the second in a 5-part series covering the topic mortality. And today we'll look at why the body is mortal. What is it in our biology that causes us to die, if not of illness or injury, then of old age? So we're now on the second of 5 episodes about mortality. And we're exploring this question: why do we die? Why must we die? There are commentators who believe that death might be overcome, that humans could become immortal. One possibility, they say, is that medical technology will advance to the point where we can edit out DNA sequences that lead to aging, improve our ability to replace organs as they wear out, and maybe even replace cells and other microscopic components, perhaps with nanotechnology. A second major contender for overcoming death is the idea that we could upload our personalities and consciousness into computer systems. Although medicine will certainly make advances, I believe it's unlikely that it will truly get to the point where we become immortal and don't ever die of old age. As far as uploading our lives into computer systems, I don't see any reason to assume that's anything other than science fiction at this point. Of course, much could change in the future, but right now at least, the likelihood seems very high that everyone alive today will someday die. The question then is, why is this true? Why do biological systems wear out and die of old age? We need to emphasize, of course, that humans are far from alone in their mortality. All the complex organisms that we're familiar with have limited lifespans. In the wild, they usually succumb to predation or other early deaths, but if they do happen to live long enough, they will eventually die of old age. And it's not just complex animals, this is also true of complex plants. So here's an ancient oak tree that's still alive, but clearly near the end of its days. We're all aware that there's an intimate relationship between animals and plants. Among other things, when animal bodies die, they decompose and become soil, that is to say, nutrients that allow plants to grow. And plants, of course, provide food and oxygen that animals need. This is basic ecology on Earth. The decomposition of bodies leading to soil formation is something that humans can certainly participate in. These days we have other ways of disposing of bodies, including embalming and cremating. But one option remains to simply bury the body in the ground in a simple box and allow it to return to the soil. In other words, it's still quite possible for us to participate in the usual way in the cycle of life, rather than altering or delaying the manner of our decomposition through embalming or cremating. So as was pointed out in the first episode of this series, death is wholly natural. Indeed, life on earth would not be life as we know it if there were no death. And we'll get back to this point toward the end of this episode. First, though, I'd like to look at the question of why we die from a more basic biological standpoint. Humans have been working to understand the body probably as long as there have been humans, but the pace of discovery began to accelerate in the Renaissance. Early on, investigators had fairly crude tools and were only able to elucidate large structures, the major organs like the heart and lungs, large blood vessels, bones, and so on. But the technology steadily improved. By the 20th century, biologists were able to investigate cellular and subcellular activity. So, for instance, they were able to work out chemical pathways within cells, the so-called metabolic cycles. Around the same time, they were working out the structure of DNA and how it's copied when cells divide and bodies reproduce. So an enormous amount of work was done in the 20th century that helped us understand how life works. Here in the 21st century, some of the earlier work of basic anatomy and cellular physiology continues, but probably the largest focus is now on complex interactions between cells and other biological systems. An obvious example here is the interaction between cells that goes on in the brain with all of its billions of nerve cells. Another example is the very complex interaction between all the different types of immune cells and all the different signaling chemicals which coordinate their activities. So the point I'm trying to make is that the body is tremendously complex, and the more we learn about it, the more we realize just exactly how complex it is. In being a complex system, it shares some features in common with complex technologies. If we look at an automotive engine, like this shiny new item here, we can predict with fair reliability that in a few decades it will no longer look so shiny and new and may not even be operable. With good mechanical repair, the engine can be made to last longer, but it's unlikely that it could be made to last forever. Sooner or later, these complex systems wear out. Now, the body is far more complex than an automobile engine, or indeed any human artifact. And as such, it needs to be repaired. Clearly, these days, we have repair mechanisms in biomedicine, such as surgeries. But for the vast majority of human history, we didn't have that, and yet the body did pretty well because it has an internal system of repair. For instance, if the skin is wounded, very quickly the tissues begin to repair themselves. Blood vessels grow in to fill the gap, along with fluids that leak out of the blood vessels, and immune cells and other reparative processes come out of the blood vessels and go to work to gradually build up scar tissue until the wound is fully healed. And there are lots of mechanisms by which the body can repair damage of various sorts. Despite that, the repair cannot keep up with all of the changes that accumulate over time as the body ages. And sooner or later, something gives way and the body dies of old age. Thus, the woman who posed for this painting is certainly dead. We know that because the painting was completed sometime in the early 1800s, and there's no way that she could possibly be alive now if she didn't die of cholera or tuberculosis, which often killed younger people in that time period. Then she, of course, went on to die of old age and is no longer on earth. This is a certainty. Well, it's a certainty for humans, but in fact there are organisms on Earth that do not die of old age. They still die. They can get eaten. They can find themselves in an inhospitable environment and succumb. But old age does not occur for a fairly simple reason. If we look at this organism here, which is actually an intestinal parasite that you may have heard of called Giardia, it reproduces by a simple division mechanism. So we have a parent organism on the left. It undergoes a complex process of cell division to generate two child organisms on the right. And the children are identical to the parent, except that they're a little bit smaller, roughly half the size of the original parent organism. Well, what's interesting to notice here is that there is not an existing older generation once the children are formed. The parent has ceased to exist, not because it died, but simply because it's been subsumed into its children. Without that older generation persisting and accumulating changes with age, there isn't any death from old age in this species. As the children grow up and get older, they don't become decrepit, they simply divide and form the next generation, which is fresh and, not aged. Well, the organisms that we know in our daily lives do not reproduce by division, they reproduce sexually. So there's actually an intimate association between mortality, that is to say, death of old age, and sexual reproduction. So the question, why die, is partially the question, why sex? Why do animals reproduce sexually when it creates a situation where death from old age follows? Well, one answer to that question comes from Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. In brief, as you probably know, that theory is fairly straightforward. The idea is that in any species, there's a population of individuals, and those individuals are not all perfectly identical. There's some variation. And the different variants do not all survive and reproduce at the same rate. And in particular, if there's a change in environment, some variants are likely to do better than others. So natural selection depends on two things. One is variation in the population, and the other is differential survival. Well, variation in the population is what sexual reproduction is all about. It's a very efficient means of generating diversity, generating new variants. And it seems likely that one of the reasons that it evolved and has persisted is because it increases the capacity of species to adapt to environmental changes and survive. There's another more subtle reason for sexuality. This is a proposal that seems quite plausible to me, although I'm not sure that it's been entirely proven. The idea here is that as complex organisms, we're susceptible to infection by many parasites. So here in 2022, we have been dealing with the COVID-19 virus for a couple of years, and that's a viral parasite. Obviously, there are many other viruses, ones that cause chickenpox, colds and flus, etc. In addition to viruses, there are bacteria, protozoan parasites, worms, even insects that can infect the human body. Now, the immune system that I mentioned earlier, with all of its complexity, is pretty good at fighting these infections. But in many cases, it doesn't completely eliminate the parasite, it simply suppresses the organism. And over time, what happens is there's a buildup of parasitic inhabitants, and these begin to deplete the vigor of the organism. So it's been proposed that one reason why sex is advantageous is that it allows for a kind of rebooting or resetting. So here we're looking at a mother with her infant. The mother's been alive for 2 or 3 decades, and during that time, she has accumulated parasites, viruses, and so on. And those are now residing in her body on a long-term basis. But her infant, having just come into the world by this sexual reproduction, is relatively free of this parasitic burden. So it may very well be that sexual reproduction allows the organism to kind of reboot at every generation and clear out the parasitic load. So from this perspective, death is serving, some vital purposes. Some really important advantages come out of it because it's so closely linked to sex. Because sex generates diversity and clears out parasites, and because it necessitates a persistence of a generation that is destined to die of old age, the death process is actually quite fundamental to our survival as a complex species. Well, there's one final answer to the question, why die, that I'd like to explore. And this has a more ecological perspective. The idea here is that death is a kind of generosity. If we look at an ancient forest, like a old-growth redwood forest, what we see are many very mature trees that tend to fill out the canopy and block light from reaching the forest floor. And the roots of the giant elder trees soak up so much moisture and nutrient that the young trees have a very hard time getting started underneath a mature forest. All that changes once one of these giant trees falls. The death of a giant redwood tree opens out a hole in the canopy that allows light to stream to the forest floor, and it also frees up a lot of moisture and nutrients that the big tree was previously absorbing. And this gives the young ones a chance to take off and have their turn at growing into ancient giant redwood trees. We see something similar happening in human families, although we may not think of it that way. But if we look at this picture with 4 generations in a single family, it's very obvious that one member is quite elderly, is not likely to survive much longer, and another is very young and just came into the world. And so there's this kind of natural handing off of opportunity and resources from the oldest to the youngest generation. And this allows, and in fact necessitates, the birth of children, birth of babies, growth of children, and a lot of what makes life joyous and meaningful. It comes out of this mortality and the regeneration of life. So by dying, the elders are giving the young ones a chance to live. That's a kind of automatic and unconscious choice that just happens, inevitably. But sometimes the generosity is more conscious. A poignant example came out of the Fukushima nuclear disaster of 2011. The amount of radioactive contamination was so severe that workers were required to go in and clean up the mess. Naturally, this was very dangerous work because there was a high level of radiation in the environment that, first of all, had the potential of causing acute radiation poisoning and death, and second of all, had the potential to cause cancers further down the line. Well, something very generous happened when older, retired nuclear engineers and other people with the necessary skill set stepped forward and insisted that they be allowed to go in and clean up the reactor in order to save the younger people from risking their lives and risking their families' well-being. These older ones said, quite honestly, we are near the end of our lives. It's our honor and our obligation to protect the younger generations by taking on this risk. So I'm not sure if any of them actually died in the short run as a consequence of this volunteer activity, but they certainly could have, and it's clearly a very generous and noble thing that they did. So going back to that idea of compost, the way bodies die and generate soil that allows new life to grow, that process of the elders falling away and leaving space and opportunity for the younger generations is a kind of similar dynamic. The old life provides opportunities to the new. So this kind of generosity in nature is essentially universal. It's really the way nature works. And we can see it, in all sorts of ways anytime we go out into the natural world. Now, academic biologists would probably say, well, it's not truly generosity because it's not really chosen. The swan here is responding to instinct in taking care of its little chick. It isn't conscious of what it's doing, and in fact, it's not even that altruistic because by taking care of its own offspring, it's favoring the propagation of its genes and so on. That all may be true on one level, but on another level, there is little doubt that there's something sweet and generous going on, by whatever motivation and however unconsciously. It's a kind of beautiful, beautiful fact of nature that we see all the time. Given how natural and generous death can be, we can answer the question, why die, with another related question, which is, why not die? Given all the purposes death serves, what would we actually gain other than, a few more years, or maybe a lot more years in our own individual case? But what would life as a whole gain by immortality? And the answer is not much. In fact, not anything. The natural world works perfectly well with a cycle of living and dying. And it's only our insistence that our individual lives, are more important than all that even makes the issue of death a problem. You may say I'm oversimplifying. What about grief? What about the fear of, everything ending? What about existential questions like what does it all mean? And maybe I am oversimplifying and kind of, ignoring some important issues. I probably am. But it still remains true that death has many advantages and has a kind of beautiful, generous aspect to it. So why die? Why not die?